Hello and welcome to Healthy Snacking. This isn't so much a snack, but this is a meal. We're going to learn how to make meatballs today. So the meatballs I'm making will be for a soup that I'm also making, and that will be a second video. But today we're going to focus on how to make meatballs. They're very easy. They taste better than frozen meatballs in my opinion, and they're really easy to make. So in here I have 1 pound of ground beef, 1 egg, just cracked open. I have half a tablespoon of ketchup, and then some breadcrumbs. If you have to watch your carbs or your sugar, you can lower the carb intake by using fresh ground low carb bread or almond flour, something like that. These just happen to actually be low carb pork rind breadcrumbs, so they're going to work the same way. You can also actually use some Parmesan cheese, and that's going to give it a little bit of extra flavor. Then I have half a teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce, and that is it. So now we're going to mix it all together. Before we do this, again, you want to make sure your hands are clean always, and then if you wear any jewelry, you might want to take that off so the jewelry is not getting in the meat and the meat's not getting inside the jewelry. So once your hands are clean, we're just going to go ahead and mix it with our hands. We want to really make sure everything's mixed well together. You could use an instrument like a fork or a spoon, or even a potato masher sometimes works well, but I find that just getting in there with your hands is a lot easier. Might be a little bit messier, but it does the job. So the egg and the breadcrumbs are going to help the meat stick together. All right, so I like to just mix that in well together to see what the consistency is before I see if I need to add some more breadcrumbs. It should be like a little sticky. We're gonna want it to kind of hold its shape a little. So because I'm using my meatballs in a soup, I'm not gonna add a lot of spice to the meatballs. The spices are gonna be in the soup, but you can go ahead and add some onion powder, some garlic powder, salt, pepper, oregano, basil, really anything to give your meatballs a little bit of extra flavor. But right now it does have the ketchup and the Worcestershire, so these are gonna have enough flavor for the soup that I'm making. All right, and once it's well mixed and incorporated together, we're going to go ahead and shape them. So I have another plate here. What I find works is just shaping them, putting them on a different plate. My hands are still dirty, that's okay. So the soup that I'm making is Italian wedding soup, so the meatballs are going to be very small. However, if you want to make regular meatballs, big meatballs, you're just going to form it into a circle, kind of roll it in between your palms. That's a really big meatball. If you want a smaller meatball, just use less meat. The meatballs I'm going to be making are very small. So this is about the size. They're going to shrink down a little bit when I cook them. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue and do this with all of the meat. I will see you when it's done because it's going to take a while and I'm sure you don't want to watch me do that. Okay, so I do have my meatballs all formed, and again, if you're making larger meatballs, you're just gonna make them bigger. You can also use this to make hamburgers, so you would just shape them into bigger, flatter patties instead of round balls for meatballs. So I have 164 meatballs here. Again, they're very small. You can see by the size of my hand, they're very small. What we're going to do now is brown them on all sides. So I have a large pan. I have some tongs. I like the metal ones. You can use the ones with silicone on the bottom. Either will work. And then what we're going to do is just take a few meatballs at a time, put them in here. We want to just brown them on the outside. Because they're going in the soup, they're gonna be cooked in the soup, so I don't have to worry about the insides being cooked, just the outsides being browned so that they hold their shape when I cook them in the soup. So if you're making larger meatballs that aren't going in a soup, you do want to make sure that they're cooked all the way through. So I'm just going to add a little bit of olive oil into the pan. And I'm going to grab another plate or a bowl. I'm going to have it off camera, but this is where I'm going to be putting the finished, well, the browned meatballs. So just gonna, I have my heat on medium high. I'm not trying to fry them. I just want to brown the outside. Again, this is going to help them retain their shape when they are in the soup cooking. We're going to be slow cooking them, so they're going to cook for a while. So again, I'm not worried about the insides getting cooked. I just want them to hold their shape when I am getting the soup cooked, and then I'm stirring the soup, and this is going to help with that. So basically, just going to scoop a bunch on here. And I'll show you the first batch, and then I'm going to do the rest off camera because, again, it's going to take a little bit, and I'm sure you don't want to sit here and watch me do that. 264 different little meatballs. So we just want a single layer. We don't want any kind of like doubled up, or even if you could have some not touching, that would be great, just to give it space on all sides. I wish you could smell this. It smells really good. Some people don't do this part when they're cooking with like a broth or a soup. They just stick them right in, but I find for me it helps them hold their shape better. So if I pick one up, you'll see it's brown on that side. So I'm just going to, let's make sure you can see. Just gonna turn them to help them get brown on all sides. The tongs work really well, but you want to be careful about splatter. You could wear oven mitts when you do this. So basically, I'm just going to continually turn these until all sides are brown. Not a dark brown, but like just a light brown like that. It seems like a lot of work, but it's not really. It's just monitoring, making sure you're turning. When it's mostly brown, I would say they're ready. If it starts to splatter, just turn your heat down a little. It doesn't have to like cook all the way through, so it doesn't need to be that hot. I'm doing it one by one, but you could just kind of like turn it like that. Ooh. This pot is okay for me to use the metal utensils on. If you have a non-stick pot, they don't recommend using metal utensils because you're going to scrape off that Teflon and you do not want to eat that. So if you are using a nonstick pan, try to use tongs or utensils that are silicone, like this kind of material, like a plasticky, heat-resistant material. So these are looking pretty good, actually. Just a few more seconds, I'd say, turning them over, making sure all sides are getting cooked. If you can go like this and they hold their shape pretty well, then they're done, because that's what I'm going to do in the soup. So I want to make sure they're just holding their shape while I'm stirring the soup. So I'm just gonna put these aside. So like this one, you can see it's not cooked all the way through, but that's fine. Again, we're going to be cooking them in the soup. If you are just making meatballs or hamburgers and you're making larger meatballs, you want to put the heat on low. I would even recommend baking them instead of putting them in a pan like this. You're going to ensure that all sides are cooked evenly and that the middle is cooked as well, because you don't want to be eating raw meat. That is not good for anyone. So now that this batch is out, I'm going to do that to the rest of these meatballs, and I'll see you when that's done. All right, so here are my mostly cooked meatballs, and they're ready for my soup. So if you're going to make bigger meatballs, again, I suggest you bake them. You want to put them on a flat tray. You can line that with aluminum foil, or you could just spray it down. And then you want to bake them in the oven at 350 degrees for at least 25 minutes. That should be good. Check one before you eat them. If they need to be cooked longer, put them back in the oven and cook them longer. So now we just made a lot of meatballs, and we are ready for our soup. So watch part 2 to learn how to make Italian wedding soup with our meatballs. Hello, and welcome back to part 2, Italian wedding soup. So right now I'm cooking everything in my Instant Pot, but you don't have to have an Instant Pot to cook this. I'll go through what you can use instead. All right, so as you can hear, my pot just started. So I had it on saute. So what you can do is use a pot, put some oil in. I already added the oil. And actually should add a little bit more. And then we're going to saute the onions. So I have about a half of a small onion diced, and I'm gonna add that into the pot. A few carrots are getting in, but that's fine. I want to sweat the onions. That means I want to cook them until they're translucent. I'm also going to add some fresh garlic. I'm making a lot of soup, so I'm going to add about 2 tablespoons of garlic. We also like garlic, so we're usually heavy-handed on the garlic. And then we're going to let that cook, and I'm going to stir it until the onions are clear or translucent. So again, in here I have some oil. I have half of a small onion diced. I have some fresh garlic minced. That's really, really small. And I'm just letting it cook until the onions look clear and we're getting those juices out of them. So we're gonna let that sit for a second. So again, I'm using the Instant Pot, but you don't have to use this. You can use a regular pot on the stove. Medium-high heat. And then you want to transfer it because we're making soup. It's a pretty large amount, so you want to make sure you have a pretty big pot. Or if you have a crock pot or a slow cooker, you can use that as well. So now we're going to add the broth. So I make my own broth with bouillon. So we're going to need chicken and beef broth, and we're going to need, let me double check, 6 cups of chicken broth and 1 cup of beef broth. So in this pitcher I have, let's see, I'll pour it out. We're gonna need 7 cups total. And I'm just gonna add that right to the onions. 3, 4, 5, 6. Perfect. 7 cups. All right. So because I'm not using broth and I'm using bouillon, I just did water, and now I will add in the bouillon. So again, it's 6 cups of chicken broth, 1 cup of beef broth. And I'm just gonna give that a stir. Your pot should still be hot from cooking the onions. If you're using a slow cooker, turn it up to high. So I'm going to use a slow cooker now. Actually, I'm gonna keep it on saute just to let it heat up a little bit. All right. So now in here we have the broth, we have the onions, and the garlic. We're also going to add carrots. So I have, it's about 4 carrots cut up. I use baby carrots, so it's a pretty big batch of carrots. We're gonna add those in next because we want to give them time to cook. And just, again, a nice stir. So we've got our carrots in there, our onions. We're going to add some basil. 1 teaspoon of basil. 1 teaspoon of parsley. If you have fresh, that works as well. And then we're going to add 1 teaspoon of oregano. So it's 1 teaspoon of basil, 1 teaspoon of oregano, and 1 teaspoon of parsley, and 1 teaspoon of garlic powder. If you don't like any of these ingredients, feel free to leave them out or add in some ingredients that you really like. Sometimes I add mushrooms to this. Okay. So now we're going to give it a good stir to make sure the spices are mixed in with the broth. And when we slow cook this, if you don't have a slow cooker and you're just using a large pot, you're just going to cook it on low heat for a very long time, a few hours. And it's really going to let it simmer. Or you could cook it on higher heat to help it cook faster. The longer you let this cook on a low heat, that's why slow cooking is really delicious. It lets the flavors meld more and they kind of incorporate better, and you just get a richer, deeper flavor. So in our last video, we made these meatballs and we're going to add them into the soup now. So these meatballs are not cooked all the way. But they're going to cook in the soup. So I'm just gonna, again, give them a good stir. All right. Typically, Italian wedding soup is made with pasta, but if you can't have pasta or you're trying to cut out the carbs, you can eat this as is. You can add low carb pasta, which is like, let me grab one. They have these shirataki noodles. And if you're diabetic and you're trying to watch your calories and your carbs and your sugar, these are fantastic. So you can add these in. You want to rinse them before you take them out of the package. Or like I said, you could just omit the pasta and just eat it as is. It's still going to be very hearty with the meatballs and the carrots. And then we're going to add spinach later, or escarole. Traditionally, Italian wedding soup is made with escarole, but I prefer spinach, so that's what I'll be using. And then we're just going to cook this on low. If you're using a crock pot, you're gonna cook this on low for 6 to 8 hours. So it's something you can make in the morning and it'll be ready by dinner time. Or you could cook it on high for 3 to 4 hours. If you're using an Instant Pot, it's notoriously known for not cooking as well as a crock pot. So if you're using an Instant Pot, you're gonna wanna slow cook for 8 hours on high or more, the more setting, which is the high setting. So you have to double it up. You're gonna cover it. And then you wanna set the seal to venting. So we don't wanna create pressure in the pot. We're just using it just to sit and meld and cook slowly. If you're using a pot on the stove, you're going to cook it on low heat. We don't want to boil, because when you boil it, you're going to evaporate the broth and it's going to thicken. That's not going to be a proper soup. So if you're using a pot, you want to cook it on low heat, covered. You could have it venting a little bit if you want, but I always cook it covered, and you're going to cook it for about 3 hours. The cooking it on the stove is a higher heat than cooking it in a crock pot usually, and the material that the crock pot is made out of, the ceramic or whatever your crock pot is made out of, helps it cook evenly all around. So it's a different type of process for cooking. So you have the Instant Pot is one way, the crock pot is another, and on the stove is a completely different. So you have options. You don't have to go out and buy a new device for this, just use what you already have. If you want to cook pasta, you can just add some pasta. I always like to do it on the side If you leave pasta in with the leftovers, the pasta kind of breaks down. It gets really soggy and oversaturated. So I always cook my pasta on the side and then serve it, you know, separately, or put it in the soup as soon as you're ready to eat the soup. Heat it up that way. Yeah, and that's about it. So this will be ready in 8 hours, and I will see you then. Okay, so for the last hour, this is where you're going to want to add escarole or spinach. So I have fresh baby spinach. That's what I prefer. If you're going to use escarole, you want to wash it very, very well, and then you want to slice it. And then this is already pre-washed, so I'm just going to add it into the soup. And if you're not familiar with cooking with spinach, it diminishes. So you might think you're adding a lot of spinach, but once it's cooked, it's really not that much. So I always add a healthy serving of baby spinach. And then again, we're gonna give it a good stir. And we're gonna let it cook for the last hour in the slow cooker, or even the last hour on the stove. So it should be good. Excellent. I will see you in 1 hour. All right, so it's been an hour. Our pasta is done. Our soup is done. So now you can put a little bit of the pasta in your bowl. Spoon out some of the soup. Let me turn this. Give it a good stir so you can really mix the ingredients. Every spoonful should be some broth, meatballs, some spinach, some carrots, and sounds like someone's excited. Excellent. So here is our finished Italian wedding soup. Again, if you're using escarole, you're gonna need that full hour. Spinach, it should wilt really fast. And it's very hot, but extremely